Hello everyone! Welcome to a video where I have to really try and avoid the elephant in the room, but I'm not going to bother. There's a big geopolitical event, you might say, going on in Eastern Europe at the moment. My opinions of it are similar to that of my colleagues over at the Wellington Project. They did a podcast on it just yesterday, and I suggest you all go watch it. My opinion lands somewhere between I want Ukraine to win and I don't particularly care. I just wish there was no war going on, but obviously this is a very complicated issue, one that I am nowhere near read up on to comment on properly. But on the Wellington Project, they go through better opinions than I can give you, and they're similar to mine, so as I say, please look in the description and go listen to them there. As for now, I'm going to be commenting on something I know a bit more about, and that is the coronavirus pandemic, specifically about the modelling. And it turns out that thing that everyone was getting banned on YouTube and Twitter for, questioning or poking holes in the current COVID narrative, appears to have completely subsided, so I'm actually going to talk about this. So back in December of last year, The Spectator put out this article by Fraser Nelson, my Twitter conversation with the chairman of the SAGE COVID Modelling Committee. This was something I would have gone through in December, but really couldn't be bothered going through COVID stuff, but since it's pretty much over, this is something I can go back in retrospect and say, my god, doesn't it feel good to have been right. The latest SAGE papers have been published, envisaging anything from 200 to 6,000 deaths a day from Omicron depending on how many more restrictions we'll get, up to and very much including another lockdown. Earlier today I had unexpected chance to ask questions of Graham Medley, the chair of the SAGE Modelling Committee. He's a professor at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which last weekend published a study on Omicron which very gloomy scenarios and making the case for more restrictions, but JP Morgan had a close look at this study and spotted something big, all the way through. LSHTM assumes that the Omicron variant is just as deadly as Delta, but evidence from South Africa suggests that Omicron infections are milder. JP Morgan pointed out in a note to clients, adjust for this, it found, and the pictures changes dramatically. Bed occupancy by COVID-19 patients at the end of January would be 33% of the peak it saw in January 2021. This would be manageable without further restrictions. So basically what seems to have happened is SAGE have taken the worst case scenario that is incredibly unreasonable, i.e. they've put garbage data in, which means they get garbage data out, which is what they give to the government. Garbage models, which is what people were saying back in December and earlier than that about COVID models, appears that it's true. I mean, we know now it's true. There wasn't need for a lockdown. We didn't really have a lockdown. We had 2 weeks of don't go in the office if you don't need to, and masks need to go back on in shops, but really it wasn't as bad as any lockdown we've seen before in Britain. So Fraser asks a very simple question. Why was this scenario left out? Why would this fairly important and fairly basic fact on Omicron modelling not presented by SAGE modellers like Professor Medley to ministers and to the general public? I was delighted to get the chance to speak to him on Twitter. It was kind of him to make the time. The conversation started with a reference to the Spectator Data Hub. It had a page devoted to the past SAGE modelling versus actual, and I wanted to make sure I was not being unfair to SAGE in my selection or presentation of these charts, because Fraser Nelson is unironically a really good journalist. The latest SAGE paper drop, the 6,000 deaths a day one, refers to scenarios, not predictions. Professor Medley emphasises a distinction, saying something could happen is not saying that there's a realistic chance of it happening. So then my question would be, what's the point in it? What is the point of an unrealistic scenario being modelled? But then why do SAGE modellers publish some scenarios and not others? Here's our conversation, and oh boy, we're going to get into this. So we start off where the article left off, Graham Medley saying the point being missed is that these scenarios are not predictions. We can't predict what people are going to do over Christmas. Many people themselves are undecided. They are made to support a decision to illustrate the possibilities and uncertainty. So Fraser replies, hi Graham, I guess the question is why LSHTM did not, like JP Morgan, include a scenario of lower virulence, given that this is a very plausible option that changes the outlook massively, see below, and it means that we get a 33% peak compared to January of last year. What would be the point of this? Not a snarky question, genuine to know, what do you think decision makers would learn from that scenario? I mean, I really hate this reply. Imagine as a modeler asking, why would I bother giving a model that's a more realistic scenario than my unrealistic one? To which my reply would be, well, a more realistic scenario is obviously more useful than a less realistic scenario. Decision makers have to base their decisions on facts or, good models, we'll say, not garbage ones we keep seeing everywhere. But I'm not going to go into more of that yet because, my god, this conversation goes off the rails. In the low virulence scenario modelled by JP Morgan, no further restrictions will be needed, so harm to economy and society might be averted. Can I ask you why you didn't think this less alarming, quite plausible scenario was worth including? Like yours, a genuine question. Graham replies, you know the answer, that's what the paper says. If somebody draws a line on a graph, it doesn't add any further information. Decision makers are generally only interested in situations where decisions have to be made. So, Fraser says back, I may be thick, but I'm afraid I don't know the answer. Why would you not, for completeness, add the scenario where Omicron is less virulent and more restrictions are not needed? To which Graham says, I meant you know what happens. That scenario doesn't inform anything. Decision makers don't have to decide if nothing happens. So what that is saying to me, in fact, no, not what that is saying to me. What that is screaming to me is that decision makers have made a decision and then ask Sage to give them an excuse to make the decisions that they have already made, which to me would be pointless. And Fraser replies, thanks, this helps me understand. So you exclusively model bad outcomes that require restrictions and omit just as likely outcomes that would not require restrictions. Which sounds mad to me. And Graham replies, we generally model what we are asked to model. There is a dialogue in which policy teams discuss with modelers what they need to inform their policy. So Fraser says, okay, so you are asked to model bad Omicron outcomes and make no comment as to their possibility. And this random guy, Reg, says, this entire exchange has left me open-mouthed. To think that all the livelihoods are at stake here, mainly because they don't see the need to model accurate outcomes as it will not make the government take any action. Effing scandalous. I'm surprised they left the fucking in there. I don't know why I just censored myself and then just said fucking, but there we go. And then Graham Medley finally says, we model the scenarios that are useful to decisions. And I'm with my boy Reg there. This is an absolute scandal. They have basically just admitted to Fraser Nelson, back in December of last year, by the way, that these models are completely useless because they are unrealistic compared to more realistic models made by JP Morgan. But JP Morgan isn't hand in hand with the government. They are not paid by the government to give the government an excuse to carry out their decisions. This is getting things arse backwards. The government are making decisions and then paying modelers to make models that give them an excuse to make these decisions, not paying modelers to make realistic and likely outcomes if no restrictions or restrictions are put in place to see which decision is best made. Basically, this is like a lot of the UK government. A lot of departments are basically just there to self-perpetuate. This is a good example of that. This department was made to enforce restrictions, or to make a decision on if we need restrictions or not. As soon as it makes a decision that we don't need restrictions, that department becomes useless and goes away. So instead they paid Sage, from the looks of it, to give them an excuse to keep going. For those of you that don't understand why I hate the civil service, this is why I hate the civil service. So we get back to Fraser's commentary on this. Note how careful he is to stay vague on whether any of these various scenarios in the SAGE documents are likely or even plausible. What happened to the original system of presenting a reasonable worst-case scenario together with a central scenario? And what's the point of modelling if it doesn't say how likely these scenarios are? Well, that's the question, isn't it? From what Professor Medley says, it's unclear that the most likely scenario is even being presented to ministers this time around. So how are they supposed to make good decisions? I highly doubt that Sajid Javid is only asking to churn out models that make the case for lockdown. That instruction, if it is being issued, will have come from somewhere else. Professor Robert Dingwall, until recently a JCVI expert, has said that Medley's candor reveals a fundamental problem of scientific ethics in SAGE, i.e. a hardwired negativity bias. The unquestioning response to the brief is very like that of SPIB's behavioural scientists, he says, and suggests that COVID inquiry looks into all this. Yes, I agree, because this does just look like pure corruption. It basically looks like, whether intentional or not, that some government department has said, right, we want a model that shows the worst case scenario, making the same assumptions as the last variant. We just want the model. We don't want any of your comments and we don't want to hear any back chat. And they probably weren't even that abrasive about it, and Sage just went, yeah, alright, here's the model. And then when questioned on why they made such a shocking model, they basically went, well, we just made what they asked. And as mentioned by Fraser, he's being very vague on whether he thinks it's likely or not. In fact, he doesn't comment on it at all. He just says, oh, I just do as I'm told, don't ask me. But this is the head of a committee of modelling COVID data. You'd think he'd have something to say on the plausibility of this model. But he didn't, probably because he's getting paid. So let's finish off this article. At a time when we have just been given a new set of scenarios for a New Year lockdown, it might be good if someone, if not Professor Medley, would clear up what assumptions lie behind the new 6,000 a day dead scenario, and if emerging information from South Africa about Omicron and its virulence had been taken into account, and how probable it is that a double-jabbed and increasingly boosted nation with 95% antibody coverage could see this sage worst-case scenario come to pass. I can only agree. In my view, this raises serious questions, not just about SAGE, but about the nature and quality of the advice used to make UK lockdown decisions, and the lack of transparency and scrutiny of that advice. The lives of millions of people rest on the quality of decisions, so the calibre of information supplied matters rather a lot. To all of us. Yes, and the UK government apparently said, give us some bad information so we can make bad decisions. I've asked Professor Medley to come on Spectator TV to have a longer conversation outside Twitter. He has written for us before, so I hope he accepts. For now, although I often curse the platform, I shall thank Twitter for giving me the chance to ask some questions of someone so well placed in such an important issue. And after a quick YouTube search, I can't find if Professor Medley actually went on Spectator TV. If you find a video of it, please let me know. But as you can see, this was back in December of 2021. And basically, the only information we can get from the committee, it seems, is that, oh, we're just doing what we're told. So now we fast forward to today, the 3rd of March 2022, and we get this lovely article. Sage modellers admit they got Omicron prediction wrong. Which, if they said that back in December, they'd probably get kicked off Twitter. COVID models significantly overestimated deaths from Omicron, in part because they failed to account for voluntary behavioural change, a parliamentary committee has been told. Not rectifying this in future could lead to important warnings being ignored, a senior scientist told MPs. Exactly. Graham Medley, oh, he's a famous name now, chairman of the SAGE modelling group, told the Commons Science and Technology Committee that in mid-December SAGE presented a range of scenarios to the government. At the lower end, they considered deaths peaking at 600 a day. At the upper end, they thought it could reach 6,000. In reality, they peaked at under 300. All I can say is, well done, Spectator, and especially Fraser Nelson. You put these people to account, and it appears that with pressure starting from last December, it's built up, and eventually now they've just had to admit, yeah, we got it completely wrong. Which is why I still have some respect for the Spectator. Medley said it was his job to consider pessimistic outcomes. The worst thing for me would be for the government to say, why didn't you tell us that it would be that bad? So inevitably, we're always going to have a worst case above reality. But he acknowledged, ideally, the best case would be below it. One key reason why the models overshot is that they do not account for changes people make themselves without legal compulsion. When they realise infections are high, this meant that the significant drop in contacts and socialising ahead of Christmas, which turned out to be equivalent to that seen in a full lockdown, were not factored in. Well, not only that, but as Fraser Nelson said, your models didn't account for the fact that they were less virulent as well. It was a milder mutation of any other COVID virus we've seen so far. So why are they just blaming this on human behaviour rather than the fact they missed out on one incredibly important aspect? The only reason I can think of this is because they want to keep that as hidden as possible, but hopefully the Spectator do an article on this, pointing out that they've completely missed out that fact here. And if they're not, well, I'm doing it right here. They missed out something really important, such as the virulency of the Omicron virus. Medley said that practically it was almost impossible to predict human behaviour. I agree with that. That doesn't explain why you were... your best case scenario was still over double the predicted amount of... double the amount of actual deaths, sorry. The epidemic is dynamic. People's responses to the situation in March 2020 were very different to those in November 2020 and very different to those again in January 2021. Dr. Raghib Ali from the MRC Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge told the committee that modellers needed to find a way to incorporate voluntary shifts in behaviour. My concern is next time there is a new variant, doctors will go on TV and say this is bad, but people will say you got it wrong last time, we're not going to listen, and that's very dangerous. Which, yes, it is very dangerous when you can't trust the experts, so to speak. And even in this apology of saying sorry we got it wrong, he still can't be fully apologetic about what he got wrong. He still won't admit that he didn't take into account the fact that it was less virulent, it spreads less than the Delta variant, and it is also milder than the other variants. So now every time Sage comes out with a model, we're just going to assume that it's below the best case scenario from them. Because they've proved to us this time that they'll just do as they're told and put out the worst case scenarios, even if they're very unrealistic. So we can only assume the realistic outcomes are way below that. So well done, you've just completely delegitimised your own institution. Luckily, this could be one of the last times I talk about COVID, because it appears that the pandemic is practically over in the UK. Basically, all restrictions are done. I mean, the only time I've worn a mask since Christmas is for mass the other day, and the main reason for that is because it's full of old people, it's full of people I know. I'd rather just do this simple thing that makes them feel comfortable while they are there sat down enjoying mass. And even that I don't think is going to last too much longer. So, pandemic's over here, this is probably the last COVID video I'm hopefully going to make, and all it basically was to dunk on the scientists saying, look at our models. Well, it turns out the Sage models at least aren't worth the paper that they are printed on. But that's everything I had for you today. So, as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.